I'm Captain Pat May, the Negotiating Committee Chairman. Joining me today is Captain Rich Brown from the Negotiating Committee and Captain Ted Donnett from the Scheduling Committee. Welcome, guys.
Thanks, Pat.
Thanks, Pat.
So today we're going to discuss Section 4 and 25. Ordinarily on some of these videos, we may run section by section. Today, because of the interrelationships between 4 and 25, it's important that we highlight a few of the issues that we've negotiated that have tentacles but going back and forth. That list contains bid period processing timeline, limited student lines, the view add build up submission, and finally notifications for open time and draft. Maybe walking through the new bid period processing windows or giving us an example of how that works would be helpful.
While we were negotiating Section 25, we saw an opportunity to fix a common gripe of our pilots about secondary lines, and that's how late the secondary lines are released during the month. Through manipulating the lengths of windows earlier in the month, we were able to achieve a little bit earlier release of the secondary lines. For captains, the lines will now be released at 12 Central on Tuesday, and the first officers will be released at 12 Central on Wednesday. So that's 29 hours earlier for the captains and 5 hours earlier for the first officers. It's not a big change, but we think that every little bit earlier helps out pilots in planning their next month and purchasing tickets. And so we were happy we were able to capture this, even though it wasn't in the original plan of the negotiating Section 25. One of the things you'll notice about the earlier windows is the difference in size between the captain's bidding window and the first officer's bidding window. And the reason for this was the new student lines that now exist in the contract.
Ted, can you give us an overview of the limited student line provisions?
Yeah, so first off, this process is entirely voluntary for the first officers. If they did not want to participate in the system, there'll be an election when they submit their bid to where if they would have been awarded a student line, it will skip that line and just award them the next one in their bid. So captain bid awards are published on Monday, and Monday afternoon, training scheduling will select up to 40% of the LCA awarded lines as student lines that afternoon. The LCA will keep his or her line, and it's also important to note that lines utilized as student lines need to be published at least 16 hours before the first officer bid closes, so first officers have time to adjust their bids as necessary. First officer lines will then be awarded at 7 a.m. on Wednesday morning, and after normal conflicts are processed, all remaining awarded credit hours are dropped and eligible for student makeup or SMU. It's important to note that SMU is paid at a guaranteed 125%. Then during the view add window, first officers with SMU will go in and be able to bid on trips using their SMU credit hours. Now, if not all the SMU credit hours are awarded, or the first officer did not bid a sufficient number of SMU credit hours, those hours will then go into their SMU bank. That bank remains available indefinitely for use in open time. The SMU has no priority, but it maintains its 125% premium.
And that's a tie-in to the new concept, which is limited student lines. That's something that, again, from the company opener, they wanted to get into essentially removing all lines in which pilots were being bumped. So in the world before this negotiation, the pilots, certain first officers would bid, buddy bid with line check airmen. And then the company identified that as an area where they felt like they were paying two pilots to do the job of one. Can we give a little more color as to the student lines and how that process is and the dynamics there?
The student lines were an area that we thought we came up with a way to include more pilot control and provided a premium for pilots that were affected by this. One of the issues we had with a larger package from the company is that they made things mandatory. So these student lines, the first part about it is that first officers that will be affected by that are able to opt out. They are not required to participate in student lines at all. And the second part of it is that we did achieve a 125% premium for all those credit hours that were part of those student lines. So the way the system would work is the company will be able to select up to 40% of the LCA lines that were actually where those captains were bidding for a line that month. So it does not include LCAs with pay-onlys. It does not include DCAs or SCAs. It's limited strictly to LCAs who are bidding for a line that month.
Yeah, so that's important. So what would be an example of, say, the Memphis bid pack and then the smaller bid packs, the impact?
So that 40% level for a Memphis bid pack would be 8 to 12 lines per bid pack. Obviously, 8 for the smaller bid packs and 12 for primarily for the 777 bid pack. And in the outer domiciles, it'll be 1 to 2 lines is all it would encompass.
Okay, so if I'm to explain this to pilots, it doesn't impact the line check airmen who are bidding in a pay-only status, correct?
It doesn't, and as a matter of fact, it doesn't affect the line check airmen at all. Line check airmen will keep the line that they bid. There's no effect whatsoever on the captain side of this bid. The effect of the student line is limited to the first officers. And as I said before, first officers are able to opt out of the whole program.
So maybe we can talk through an example, right? If I'm a first officer, senior first officer, and I have this change now, and I may be interested in, say, going after the 125%. Ted, can you talk me through maybe the process from the point that I see the LCAs and what they're bidding?
The captains will get their awards on Monday afternoon, and at that time the company is going to select up to 40% of lines of that group of LCAs that they wish to designate as student lines. From that point, the first officers have at least 16 hours to adjust their bids as they see necessary, and then the first officers will get their lines awarded to them on Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. At that point, then during the conflict window, anything that would drop off of a first officer's line, such as vacation or trips that are removed for training, would be removed, and any remaining credit hours are then dropped and designated as student makeup hours. The first officers can then go into the view add window, pick up trips if they desire, and those trips are paid a guaranteed 125% premium. The first officers are not required to pick up those trips, or if they don't designate enough trips that would make up their student makeup hours, then the student makeup hours would go into a student makeup bank. That bank never expires and lives on indefinitely that they could use to pick up open time.
And that bank also maintains that 125% premium. So if the pilot does decide to use that later on in open time, he would still get the 125% for those credit hours.
So it's essentially treated very similar to other banks that we can carry forward through our whole entire career. In other words, they may not go away. So later on, as a captain, I may find myself having a lot of time in my hands, but I still have that SMU bank that's sitting there where the trips pay out at 125%, and I can really go grab one of those trips if I want, even as a captain at that point, right?
Exactly. The bank never expires.
And it's
okay.
Treated just like any other makeup bank, like your makeup vacation, makeup sick, general makeup. It lives in the same section of the contract as those makeup banks.
And this also has an interaction with another thing in the view add buildup that we recently negotiated. So it's not just about this pilot wanting to build up their line, which you mentioned if the pilot, the first officer wants to build the line up. We also negotiated new language where a pilot could actually increase their credit hours through VIPs. How would that work out, Rich? What is it?
So the buildup is basically just a way for pilots to spend less time on their bid in the view add window. As we all know, the view add window requires bids for specific trips. So if you have a large number of credit hours to make up, you may have to go through a whole lot of trips to make sure that you put enough bids in that you don't end up short for the month. What the build-up submission allows you to do is, it's a two-part process. You select that you want to be built up, which means that the company will attempt using whatever's left in open time after the original view add bids are awarded. They'll use whatever's left in there to then build up your line to at least min bid period guarantee and no more than 6 hours over your awarded BLG. Basically, why would you want this? Well, it allows you to put in just the lines and the trips that you want in the view add window and then say, okay, if I don't get any of those, I don't really care what I get. I just want to get something. So you can put in a build-up submission and say, I want you to build my lineup. And then the second part of the system is you can put in criteria for that build-up submission. So you can say, for instance, if I don't get any of these trips I bid, I want to get double deadheads to the West Coast, or I want to get whatever your request would be. And then the company will attempt to fill your line with those things. Just be aware that if they don't have enough of those particular pieces, they will build you up using whatever's in there if you select that build-up option.
Could they use reserve?
They could use reserve. They can use anything that's still left in open time, which includes reserve blocks.
And it's just to get me back to mid-bid period guarantee, but I could also go over, couldn't I, with this?
You could. You could go all the way up to 6 hours over your awarded BLG.
Okay.
Just like any other award in the view add window.
But
Right.
of course, this is optional, Pat. You don't have to do it if you don't want to.
And it's a good point. So this issue is one of the issues that the company brought to us in negotiations. In their Section 25 and Section 12 discussion, the company wanted to mandate. In other words, they proposed pushing a pilot, forcing them up through mid-bid period guarantee, so mandating additional flying. Obviously, we weren't interested. We defended against that position. But like many issues that we've dealt with that we initially viewed as problematic, we tried to listen to the company's concerns. If it was possible to address it, then we said, well, how would the pilots want this fixed? And so we always took that approach. We always kept the pilot in mind. And if we kept the pilot in the driver's seat, in other words, the pilots are the final decision makers. We didn't want to force decisions or conditions upon them in their monthly bidding or flying. And this is a perfect example of one of those things where we kept the pilots in the driver's seat. The pilot can elect to do this or not, and we stayed away from mandating additional flying for the pilots.
Options are good.
So let's talk about options and some things that pilots like or enjoy, and that's going into open time and trying to make improvements on their monthly bidding. Some new things here to talk about, right?
Yeah, exactly. One of the best parts about our job is the time off that we have and the flexibility that we have. Yet, after all of these bidding procedures, we still find ourselves often, or many pilots find themselves often, checking open time, trying to improve their schedule. And it's gotten to the point where a lot of pilots are spending significant portions of their time off looking at their bidding programs, trying to find an open trip that fits their criteria. So with that in mind, we looked for a way in order to improve it, and the idea that we ended up settling on was a way to where the pilots aren't going to be required to have to go in and check for open time anymore. They can put criteria in, such as certain trips on certain days, certain layovers, deadheads, what have you, and now through optionally a text message will then come to the pilot telling them that that trip is available. At that point, the system functions the same way that it does today. The pilot's still going to have to submit for the bid line adjustment, and they will be processed in timestamp order, but it will have a significant effect of relieving us from the necessity of having to check our phones and check our devices all the time looking for that trip that might improve our lifestyle.
Anything else in addition to open time? In other words, where if a pilot is interested in and has time available on the calendar and they want to draft?
Yes, the draft system's another piece of feedback that we received that pilots were frustrated with, that they did not care for the transparency or perceived lack of transparency of that system. Using this new text message system, when a draft trip is available, the company will now send out an optionally, if pilots have opted in, a text message that draft is available. What happens next depends on how far away from the show time of the trip that we are. If you're more than 4 hours away from the show time of the trip, the system will operate very similar to our current volunteer system, whereas the group of pilots who are interested in the draft trip will notify the company. The company will then look at that list of pilots, and the pilot with the least amount of draft credit hours in the past 180 days will receive that trip. Now, if there's 2 pilots with the same amount of draft credit hours in the past 180 days, the trip will then go to the most senior pilot of that group. But if we're in a time crunch and we're within 4 hours of the show time of the trip, then the first pilot to respond to the draft request will then get the draft trip.
Yeah, so it's almost equivalent to what we've seen the company do when they're short of pilots and you walk into AOC and they have a trip up there, right? And they're saying drafting for a trip, whatever, to Memphis to Miami. So it's that, but now it's automated. I mean, essentially that's what we've done here, right?
Yes, and it's made it so that more pilots can be aware of what trips are available rather than just hoping you happen to be on the phone list on the day that you are interested in a draft trip.
Yeah, we know now we're all tethered to our phones, so it seems like an interesting way to inform the pilots, but not mandating. Again, not mandating the pilots acknowledge any open time or draft pings that they may be getting on their phone if they've signed it up for that program.
Again, options are good, and this is an optional system. Pilots do not have to participate.
And I'll say this was a big area of concern for the scheduling group for the PSIT. It was an item of concern for the pilots, and that has to do with big umbrella real-time trip trading. And the company's programming isn't at a point, and with this focused negotiation, we were not going to get into a fully developed real-time trip trading, but we certainly see this as like the first measure, the first toe in the water here, right, to try something that is uses technology to get us into the real-time trip trading, right?
We don't know if we will end up with real-time trip trading, but we did sit down in small group discussions with the company as to how their system works and how we could improve on that system. And we didn't feel that real-time trip trading or something along those lines was something that was obtainable in a focused negotiation. We felt this was the next best option that still achieved our goal, which overridingly was to allow our free time to be our free time and not time that we needed to be checking open time all the time.
Well, thanks, guys. Again, this is really part one of a two-part series. There's a lot to digest on these new topics for pilots. We hope they find this informative. As we shift over to go into the next video, I want pilots to keep in mind that there's a significant amount of education material that's going to come out on fdxta.com. There you'll see a schedule of the road shows. You're going to find really our foundational information, and that's the actual TA. When the pilots go and they want the source document, you need to look to the actual TA'd section, which is highlighted in the areas that we've changed. So that's the source document. We've also added in podcasts and things like this, videos. So we'll do other things. We'll add in graphics where it's necessary, but that's going to be really the pilot's central focus and source when they want to receive information about the education or the newly negotiated language that we've put in place. The road shows obviously will be very important as we go out and we talk to pilots one-on-one. And then the last thing we'll have under the TA education series will be an FAQ section that's been built up over many months now from direct pilot input. So we hope you find this helpful. Look forward to the next video that we have to hit sections 4 and 25. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat.